By the summer of 1943, the 617 Squadron was the most famous unit in the Royal Air Force. They were the specialists, the elite scalpel of Bomber Command. While the rest of the RAF was engaged in the grim business of area bombing, the men under Wing Commander Guy Gibson were being groomed for precision work that defied the laws of physics. However, the success of the Ruhr raid had left the British High Command with a dangerous appetite for more. They looked at the map of Europe and saw another industrial heart beating behind a wall of concrete: the hydroelectric dams of northern Italy. The target was the Lago di Tirso Dam in Sardinia and several key structures in the Alpine valleys. The goal was to cripple the Italian power grid, plunging their munitions factories into darkness and forcing a collapse of the Italian fascist government. This wasn't just a military strike, it was a psychological hammer blow designed to knock Italy out of the war before the Allies even set foot on the mainland. But there was a problem. The Germans and Italians weren't fools. They had seen what happened to the Möhne. The bouncing bomb, known officially as Upkeep, was no longer a secret. Every dam in Europe was now protected by heavy torpedo netting and double the anti-aircraft batteries. To strike again, the 617 would have to do the impossible. They would have to fly even lower, in more treacherous terrain, with a weapon that the enemy was already expecting. The second mission was shrouded in a level of secrecy that rivaled the first. The crews were told they were going on extended training, but the atmosphere at the Scampton airfield was thick with a different kind of tension. These men were the Dambusters. They were national heroes, but they were also exhausted. Many of the original crews had been lost in the Ruhr, replaced by young men who had inherited a legacy of suicide missions. Barnes Wallis, the eccentric genius behind the bouncing bomb, was already back at his drawing board, attempting to refine the upkeep for the thin, cold air of the Alps. The mission was designated as a follow-up, but in reality, it was an entirely new type of war. They wouldn't be flying over the predictable terrain of the German lowlands. They were going into the Devil's Teeth, the high alpine passes where the weather could change in a heartbeat and where a single navigational error meant flying directly into a granite wall. As the Lancasters were fueled and the special stores, the massive drum-shaped bombs, were winched into the bays, the men of the 617 realized they were no longer just pilots. They were the protagonists of a sequel that history was already beginning to forget before it even started. The stage was set for a raid that would prove far more costly and far more complex than the one that made them famous. The transition from the flat, misty lowlands of Westphalia to the jagged, vertical labyrinth of the Italian Alps was a shift from tactical difficulty to geographical impossibility. For the pilots of the 617 Squadron, the Ruhr raid had been a test of nerves. The Italian mission was a test of survival against the Earth itself. Navigating a 4-engine Avro Lancaster, a heavy, lumbering beast of a bomber, through mountain passes at midnight was an act of collective madness. The mission required the Lancasters to fly at altitudes that were often lower than the surrounding peaks. This wasn't the 60 feet of the Ruhr. This was weaving between granite walls where the wingtips felt close enough to brush the pines. In the Ruhr, the pilots used the reflection of spotlights on the water to judge their height. In the Alps, the moonlight created a treacherous optical illusion called false horizons. A shadow cast by a peak could look like a valley, and a shimmering glacier could look like open air. One slight pull on the yoke at the wrong moment meant a controlled flight into terrain, a polite military term for vaporizing against a mountain. The air in the high valleys was thin and unpredictable. Thermal currents surged up from the valley floors, buffeting the planes and making the delicate task of maintaining a steady bombing altitude nearly impossible. The Lancaster was never designed for this kind of nap of the earth flying. Its massive wingspan, so stable at 20,000 feet, became a liability in the narrow gorges of the Alpine foothills. The pilots had to fight the controls with every muscle, their hands cramping around the yokes as they wrestled the vibrating airframes through tight banking turns that pushed the heavy bombers to their aerodynamic limits. Communication was another casualty of the terrain. The towering walls of rock acted as a natural shield, cutting off radio contact between the aircraft. Each Lancaster became a lonely island in a sea of black rock. If a plane went down, there would be no distress call, no fiery explosion seen by the others, just a silent disappearance into the shadows. As they approached the Lago di Tirso, the topography became even more compressed. The dam sat at the bottom of a deep, bowl-like valley. To get the required run-up for a bouncing bomb, the pilots had to perform a terrifying maneuver. They had to dive steeply over the surrounding ridges, level out at 60 feet above the water in a matter of seconds, and then pull up sharply to clear the peaks on the far side. It was a roller coaster ride in a 40-ton machine carrying a spinning, 5-ton drum of high explosives. The physical toll on the crews was immense. The cockpits were freezing, but the pilots were drenched in sweat from the sheer exertion of the flight. The navigators were hunched over their charts, desperately trying to match the dark shapes of the peaks outside to the contour lines on their maps. One wrong turn into a blind valley, a canyon that narrowed until it was impossible to turn around, was a death sentence. As they neared the target, the silence of the mountains was broken by the roar of 8 Merlin engines, a sound that echoed off the cliffs like a physical blow. They had reached the Alpine peril, and the real nightmare, the failure of their primary weapon, was about to begin. The legend of the bouncing bomb was built on the physics of the Ruhr: flat water, long approach paths, and dams that sat square and perpendicular to the direction of flight. But as the 617 Squadron descended upon the Italian targets, the mathematical elegance of Barnes Wallis's upkeep drum began to unravel in the face of Alpine reality. The first problem was the water itself. The reservoirs in the Alps were not like the deep, predictable basins of Germany. The Lago di Tirso was low due to a summer drought, exposing jagged rock formations and silt beds just beneath the surface. For the bouncing bomb to work, the water needed to act as a semi-solid trampoline. On this night, the low water levels changed the hydrodynamics entirely. When the first Lancaster released its 5-ton cylinder, the spinning drum hit the water and, instead of skipping gracefully toward the dam wall, it struck a submerged sandbar. The physics were unforgiving. The bomb didn't skip, it digged. It lost all its forward momentum in a violent plume of white spray and sank harmlessly into the mud, hundreds of yards short of the target. The second failure was the terrain-imposed approach angle. In the Ruhr, the pilots had miles of flat water to stabilize their height at exactly 60 feet and their speed at 240 miles per hour, the narrow Goldilocks zone required for the bomb to skip. In the Italian valleys, there was no such luxury. The pilots were forced to drop the planes over ridges and slam them down toward the water's surface. This meant many of the bombs were released while the aircraft was still in a slight descent or at an uneven bank. If the spinning drum hit the water at even a 3-degree tilt, it didn't bounce straight. It would corkscrew wildly to the left or right, skipping away from the dam and toward the rocky banks of the reservoir. One crew watched in horror as their bomb skipped 3 times, hit a protruding crag of alpine granite, and detonated prematurely. The blast wave, channeled by the narrow canyon walls, nearly swatted the Lancaster out of the sky, buckling the bomb bay doors and shattering the glass in the rear turret. Finally, there was the fascist defense factor. The Italians, forewarned by the destruction of the Möhne, had installed sophisticated torpedo netting that sat much deeper and was made of heavier gauge steel than the German versions. Even the bombs that did manage to skip correctly found themselves snagged in a web of steel. The upkeep was designed to roll down the face of the dam and explode at a specific depth to create a hydrostatic shockwave. When caught in the nets, the bombs exploded too far from the concrete wall. The water absorbed the blast, sending a massive useless geyser of water into the air but leaving the dam itself with nothing more than a few superficial cracks. As the moon hung high over the peaks, the Dambusters realized their miracle weapon was a dud in this environment. The bouncing bomb, a masterpiece of engineering, was a specialist tool that had met a problem it wasn't designed to solve. The 617 Squadron was sitting in the middle of an alpine furnace, surrounded by anti-aircraft fire that was now zeroing in on their low-level silhouettes, and their primary means of destruction had failed. They were left with 2 choices: flee back across the peaks in shame, or find a way to destroy a concrete titan using nothing but their wits and the conventional explosives they had brought as an afterthought. With the upkeep bouncing bombs either mired in the mud or tangled in torpedo netting, the mission shifted from a calculated scientific experiment to an act of desperate, improvised violence. The crews of the 617 Squadron were not just pilots, they were problem solvers in 10-ton suits of armor. As the tracers from Italian 20mm Breda cannons began to crisscross the valley, Wing Commander Guy Gibson's voice, or the voices of the flight leaders who succeeded him, crackled over the high-frequency radio with a grim command: switch to secondary. Most of the Lancasters carried a small reserve of heavy, conventional bombs, standard 1,000-pound and 500-pound high explosives, intended for suppressing flak batteries or clearing pathfinder markers. Against a gravity dam made of hundreds of thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, these bombs were like throwing pebbles at a castle. But the Dambusters knew that if they couldn't breach the dam with a single hydrostatic shock, they would have to do it by drilling. What followed was a display of low-level precision that bordered on the suicidal. To make a conventional bomb effective against a dam, it had to hit the crown, the very top edge where the walkway meets the water, or be dropped into the spillway gates, the mechanical lungs of the dam. But standard bombs aren't designed to skip. They fall in a parabolic arc. To hit a target as narrow as the crest of a dam while flying at 240 miles per hour, the pilots had to fly even lower than they had for the bouncing bombs. The Lancasters began a series of attack runs that saw them screaming across the surface of the reservoir at heights of less than 30 feet. The crews in the rear turrets reported seeing their own slipstream carving a furrow in the water behind them. The bomb aimers, lying flat on their stomachs in the plexiglass nose, weren't using the fancy Dambuster sight anymore. They were using grease pencil marks on the glass and raw instinct. They waited until the massive gray wall of the dam filled their entire field of vision, until it felt like they were about to fly directly into the concrete, before screaming, "Steady! Steady! Bomb gone!" The bombs weren't enough to collapse the entire structure, but they were dropped with such pinpoint accuracy that they began to systematically dismantle the dam's infrastructure. One Lancaster managed to drop a 1,000-pounder directly onto the powerhouse at the base of the Terso Dam. The resulting explosion didn't just cut the power, it sent a surge of electrical fire back through the grid. Another crew targeted the sluice gates. By destroying the mechanical controls that regulated the water flow, they ensured the dam would eventually overtop and erode itself from the inside out. The improvisation extended to their defense. Without the spinning requirement of the bouncing bomb, the pilots were free to use the Lancaster's speed more effectively. They began using the mountain shadows to pop up over the dam, release their ordnance, and immediately wing over into a steep dive into the dark valleys on the other side, playing a lethal game of hide-and-seek with the Italian searchlights. It was a messy, localized victory. They didn't get the cinematic wall of water that had defined the Ruhr, but they had crippled the heart of Sardinia's industry. They had proven that the 617 Squadron wasn't a one-trick pony, dependent on Barnes Wallis's genius. They were a force of nature that could adapt to failure and still deliver a killing blow. But as they turned their noses back toward the high alpine passes for the return journey, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the cold realization that the mountains were still waiting for them, and they were no longer in a mood to let the intruders go. The triumph of the improvised victory at the dams was short-lived, immediately eclipsed by the harrowing reality of the return journey. While the Ruhr raid is remembered for its spectacular success, it is often forgotten that the 617 Squadron's foray into the Alps and the Mediterranean was, proportionally, a far more lethal endeavor. The cost of this forgotten mission wasn't just measured in aluminum and oil, it was measured in the sudden, silent erasure of elite crews who had survived the most dangerous skies over Germany, only to be claimed by the unforgiving geography of Italy. The primary factor in the rising body count was the altitude trap. On the way in, the planes were heavy with bombs and adrenaline. On the way out, they were lighter, but the crews were physically and mentally spent. Exhaustion is a silent killer in aviation. After hours of low-level maneuvering and dodging flak, the pilots' reaction times slowed by fractions of a second. In the Alpine passes, a fraction of a second is the distance between life and a fireball. Several Lancasters, navigating the narrow corridors of the Piedmont region, simply failed to clear the saddle of the high ridges. Without a moon to illuminate the rock, and with their altimeters struggling in the shifting barometric pressure of the mountains, they flew straight into the peaks at cruising speed. There were no survivors, and in most cases, no wreckage would be found for decades. The Italian defenses, though often mocked in popular history, were lethal in the context of the Alpine valleys. Because the Lancasters were forced to follow the natural contours of the riverbeds, the Italian anti-aircraft gunners knew exactly where the planes would appear. They didn't need radar, they simply pointed their Breda 20mm cannons at the neck of the valley and waited for the roar of the Merlins. The narrow canyons acted as acoustic amplifiers, giving the gunners several miles of warning. The Lancasters were caught in gauntlets of fire, where tracers reflected off the rock walls, creating a dizzying, strobe-like environment that blinded the pilots. One by one, the icons of the 617 began to fall. Crews that had become household names in Britain vanished into the Mediterranean or the snowy crevices of the Alps. The loss rate for these follow-up missions began to climb toward 40%, a staggering figure even by Bomber Command's grim standards. Unlike the Ruhr raid, where the special stores, the bombs, were the main loss, here it was the experience that was being bled out. The RAF was losing the very men who had invented the art of precision bombing. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the cost was the long way home. Several aircraft, damaged by flak or struggling with engine failure due to the thin mountain air, couldn't make the climb back over the Alps. They were forced to head toward North Africa, crossing the Mediterranean with leaking fuel tanks and wounded crew members. Some ditched in the sea, their SOS calls swallowed by the vastness of the water. Others made dead-stick landings in the Tunisian desert, the magnificent Lancasters breaking apart on the dunes. By the time the remaining aircraft touched down at their home bases, the celebratory atmosphere of the Ruhr was gone. The hangars were full of empty berths. The ground crews stood in silence as they realized that the Dambusters had been decimated. They had struck the heart of Italy, yes, but the mountains had taken a tithe that the squadron could ill afford. The cost was so high, and the tactical results so much harder to explain to a public hungry for breached dams, that the mission began to be whispered about as a failure, a costly sequel that the Air Ministry was already preparing to bury. The silence that followed the Italian raids was not the silence of peace, but the silence of the archive. In the grand narrative of World War II, Operation Chastise, and the breaching of the Ruhr Dams are treated as a complete, self-contained epic. The follow-up missions against the Italian dams, despite their technical complexity and the staggering bravery of the crews, have been relegated to the footnotes of history. The question is, why? Why did the story of the Dambusters' forgotten sister vanish from the public consciousness? The first reason was propaganda utility. The Ruhr raid was a perfect story for a Britain under siege. It had a clear before and after. The dams were standing, then they were gone. The images of the breached Möhne and Eder were spectacular, easily captured by reconnaissance Spitfires and splashed across the front pages of newspapers. They provided a visual of German industry literally being swept away. In contrast, the Alpine raids were messy. The dams didn't collapse, they were merely crippled. The damage, shattered sluice gates, destroyed powerhouses, and electrical grid failures, didn't make for good headlines. To the average citizen in 1943, a dam that was still standing looked like a failure, regardless of whether it was actually functional. The second reason was the shadow of Guy Gibson. The original Dambusters raid was inextricably linked to the personality of Wing Commander Guy Gibson. He was the face of the squadron, the hero the RAF needed. However, as the 617 Squadron transitioned into these more obscure, specialized missions, the star power faded. Gibson himself moved on to other roles, and the men who led the Italian raids, though equally heroic, didn't fit the same mold of the dashing, singular protagonist. Without a central hero to anchor the story, the public interest began to drift back toward the massive 1,000-bomber raids over Berlin. Thirdly, there was a tactical embarrassment regarding the upkeep bomb. Barnes Wallis's bouncing bomb was a triumph of British ingenuity, but the Italian mission proved it was a highly limited tool. The failure of the bomb to work in the low-water, high-altitude environment of the Alps was a technical setback that the Air Ministry was not keen to publicize. Admitting that the miracle weapon had been defeated by a summer drought and some torpedo netting would have undermined the psychological impact of the Ruhr victory. It was easier to let the mission fade than to explain why the weapon of the century had become a 5-ton paperweight in the Mediterranean. Finally, there was the post-war narrative. When the war ended, history was written by the victors with an eye toward the most dramatic and decisive moments. The collapse of the Italian fascist government happened shortly after these raids, but it was attributed to the Allied landings in Sicily and the internal coup against Mussolini. The silent sabotage of the Italian power grid by the 617 Squadron was a contributing factor, but it was a nuanced one, a slow burn effect rather than a sudden explosion. Today, the 617 Squadron is still honored, but their forgotten sister mission remains a secret shared only by aviation historians and the families of those who never returned from the Alps. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous missions are often the ones that don't end in a cinematic explosion, and that the highest price is often paid for victories that the world never hears about. The Dambusters did more than just break the Ruhr. They fought the very earth itself in the peaks of Italy, leaving behind a legacy that was written in the shadows of the mountains and buried in the silence of time.